Hi everyone. Welcome back. We're glad to have you with us today. After discovering his wife's betrayal with an old rival, a man quietly vanishes to rebuild his life in the wilderness, unaware that karma is unraveling a brutal chain of events for those who tried to destroy him, until a heartfelt message from the past forces him to decide between closure and vengeance. So let's start. I woke up early that morning, feeling a bit restless, my mind bouncing between the day ahead and the fact that my wife, Jessica, would finally be home. She had been away on a work trip for weeks, and the house had felt hollow in her absence. I wanted everything to be perfect, coffee brewing, the living room spotless, and her favorite blanket draped neatly over the armrest of the chair. When the front door creaked open, there she stood, bathed in the soft glow of morning sunlight filtering through the hallway windows. Her smile, though weary, radiated warmth. Without thinking, I pulled her into my arms and held her close. "Welcome home, Jess," I murmured. She hugged me tightly, her head resting gently on my shoulder. "It feels so good to be back," she whispered. After a few moments, she stepped back, reached in her bag, and pulled out a small white stick. Her face softened into a delicate smile as she said, "I've got something to tell you." Then came the bombshell. "I'm pregnant, Michael." For a second, I just stared, trying to grasp the weight of her words and the object in her hand. A mix of astonishment and joy surged through me. "Jess, are you serious?" "Wow." I finally managed, reaching out to clasp her hand tightly, as though to anchor myself in the moment. She nodded, laughing softly as a tear escaped her eye. "Yes, we're going to be parents, Mike. Isn't that something to celebrate?" She leaned in, gave me a quick kiss, and squeezed my hand. Even though happiness swelled in me, a faint shadow of doubt lingered. We hadn't felt as connected in recent months, not since before her trip, and I hesitated before voicing my concern. But Jessica just chuckled, brushing it off and saying how timing could sometimes be unpredictable. She promised to book a doctor's appointment to confirm everything. Reassured but still uneasy, I nodded and grabbed my coat and briefcase for work. Her words echoed in my mind as I left, the lingering doubt stubbornly refusing to fade. By the time I reached the office, I could barely focus on the stack of contracts and the flood of unread emails. My thoughts kept pulling me back to the first time I met Jessica. That night, 5 years ago, had changed everything. It was during a company event celebrating my promotion to senior manager. The energy of the evening still felt vivid. Laughter, the hum of conversation, and my own pride bubbling under the surface. Amid the crowd, I noticed her, Jessica, across the room, laughing and chatting with my colleague, Brandon Carter. Brandon, as driven as I was, had a reputation for being cocky and often took credit for work he hadn't done. Our relationship was competitive, to say the least, with a layer of mutual respect beneath the constant rivalry. That night, he was his usual bold self, laughing obnoxiously and gripping Jessica's arm like she was some sort of trophy. I saw the way Brandon leaned in, as if to stake his claim. He thrived on competition, but I wasn't about to let him have the upper hand. Determined, I introduced myself to Jessica, and soon enough, we were deep in conversation, sharing laughter over trivial things, while Brandon hovered nearby, clearly irritated. Jessica was sharp, effortlessly engaging, and her natural charm pulled me in right away. As the evening wore on, Brandon's swagger escalated, his boasts about his grand career plans becoming more absurd by the minute. I could see Jessica's interest waning as his arrogance grew tiresome. When Brandon left to mingle with a group of executives, I seized the chance. Offering to get her a drink, I was rewarded with her relieved smile. From that moment, everything just seemed to fall into place. We exchanged numbers, and what began as a simple coffee meetup quickly turned into dinner dates, hours-long conversations, and weekends exploring the city together. Quiet nights at my apartment became our favorite routine. For the first time in my life, I felt deeply connected to someone. Jessica was compassionate, intelligent, and made me feel truly understood, as though I'd finally found my home. A year later, as we strolled along the beach under the glow of a full moon, I couldn't wait any longer. Taking her hand, I looked into her eyes, and with a mix of nerves and certainty, asked her to marry me. Her face lit up as she said yes, her smile brighter than the moonlight. We found a cozy house near the ocean and spent countless hours turning it into our sanctuary. From arranging furniture to picking paint colors, we made it our own. Some days we'd sit on the back porch, listening to the waves and sharing everything from dreams to doubts. We built our life together with plenty of laughter and love. Even though, like any couple, we had our share of little spats, arguments over chores, late nights at work, or even silly things like how the kitchen should be organized. But no matter what, we always found our way back to each other. I often thought about those moments, both the good ones and the rough patches. I could picture Jessica's smile, hear her laughter, and feel the warmth of her hand in mine. But now, with the news of the baby, something felt off. I couldn't shake this nagging thought. Was Jessica telling me the whole truth? There were just a few things about her pregnancy that didn't quite add up. Still, I tried to brush it aside. I loved her, and I wanted to trust her. By the time I got home that evening, I had managed to push most of those doubts to the back of my mind. When I opened the front door, I was greeted by the soft glow of candlelight and the comforting scent of a home-cooked meal. Jessica had gone all out. Dinner was set with our favorite dishes, a glass of wine waiting for me, and sparkling water for her. We laughed, swapped stories about our day, and for a while, everything felt normal. Jessica seemed happier than ever, glowing with excitement, her words tender and affectionate. I felt my tension ease as we talked. After dinner, she took my hand and gave me a playful smile. "Let's head upstairs," she teased. I hesitated, glancing at her belly and mentioning the pregnancy. But she just laughed softly. "Oh, Mike," she said, with that comforting smile of hers. "I already checked with the doctor. It's perfectly fine." That night, we went to bed, and I did my best to shove those lingering doubts out of my mind. But 2 days later, she returned from another doctor's appointment with news that hit me like a punch to the gut. "I'm about 4 weeks along," she said, smiling as she shared the update. My brain went into overdrive, doing the math. For weeks? I was certain we hadn't been intimate 4 weeks ago. My stomach twisted in knots. When I carefully brought it up, Jessica brushed it off like it was nothing. "Of course it happened," she insisted with a sweet, practiced smile. "You must have just forgotten." Her explanation was smooth, too smooth. I nodded along, pretending to accept it, but inside my mind was racing. Something wasn't right. The more I thought about it over the next few days, the heavier those doubts became. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. Then things got worse. I started noticing an uncomfortable irritation down there. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe just a rash, I thought. But it didn't go away. It only got worse. I decided to go see a doctor. I didn't tell Jessica. I didn't want her to worry. And honestly, I wasn't ready to share what I was thinking. After a few tests, I sat in the doctor's office, waiting for results. I hoped it would be something minor, something easy to fix. But the doctor's expression told me otherwise. "You've tested positive for an STD," he said bluntly. The words hit me like a sledgehammer. An STD? My mind reeled. How could that be? Jessica and I had been married for years. I hadn't been with anyone else. The reality of it all came crashing down. Suddenly, all those doubts I'd been trying to bury came roaring back to the surface. I couldn't ignore them anymore. I needed answers. One morning, when Jessica was out running errands, I decided to look through her things. I know it wasn't right, but I couldn't help myself. I opened her laptop and carefully sifted through her emails and documents from her recent business trip. Jessica worked for a different company now, and I hadn't paid much attention to her new colleagues. But what I found made my stomach drop. Scrolling through her itinerary, I saw a name that instantly brought back memories I'd rather forget. Brandon Carter. I hadn't seen or heard his name in over a year. He left our company long ago, and I figured I'd never have to think about him again. But there it was, his name, right next to Jessica's, on the list of attendees for her work trip. Brandon wasn't just at the same event. He was listed as one of her team members. Everything started clicking into place, and it felt like a trapdoor had opened beneath me. Brandon had always been competitive, always looking for a way to get ahead. Back then, he'd made it obvious he was interested in Jessica, but she chose me. Was this his way of getting back at me? Was he trying to worm his way back into her life? The questions circled in my mind, faster and faster, until one terrible thought settled in like a dark cloud. Had Brandon and Jessica rekindled something while they were away? Suddenly, memories of that night at the company party years ago came rushing back. The rivalry, the arrogance, the way Brandon had hovered around Jessica like she was some kind of prize to win. I remembered the way his eyes followed her, how he acted possessive, as if claiming her would prove something. Had this business trip given him the perfect chance to try again? The thought nagged at me. Jessica had chosen me back then, and Brandon had never been one to handle rejection gracefully. Could he be using this new job connection to stir up old wounds, maybe settle a score? Or, even worse, had something between them reignited while they were away? As these questions swirled in my head, puzzle pieces started to fit together in a way I couldn't ignore. I had no hard proof, but the picture forming in my mind pointed to betrayal. It wasn't just the potential affair that haunted me. It was the possibility of being made a fool. The idea that Jessica might pass off someone else's child as mine hit me hard. If the baby wasn't mine, she could secure a hefty alimony or a large portion of my assets during a divorce. I knew I couldn't afford to sit idly by. I had to protect myself. Within days, I met with a lawyer and a financial advisor. I laid everything out. The strange timing of Jessica's pregnancy, her connection to Brandon, and my growing doubts. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Melanie, didn't waste a second. She laid out a plan to safeguard everything I'd worked for. The first step, she said, is to set up a trust fund. This trust would hold all my major assets: our house, my retirement fund, and my stocks. On paper, the trust would own everything, not me. Legally, that meant Jessica wouldn't be able to claim these assets in the event of a divorce. I'd remain the trustee, managing the assets, but they'd be out of her reach. Next, my financial advisor recommended moving my savings to offshore accounts in countries with strict privacy laws. By transferring my funds to international banks, I could keep them safe from potential legal claims. You should also consider diversifying your assets, he advised. Gold, collectibles, things that aren't traceable on paper. The idea was to convert part of my savings into physical assets, storing them in secure, private vaults. That way, they wouldn't show up in any financial records tied to my name. Melanie also suggested a strategy to reduce the value of our house in case Jessica tried to claim it in a settlement. She advised me to take out a significant loan against the property. The loan funds would be placed in a secured account under her firm's control. On paper, the house's value would appear much lower due to the debt. If she tries to go after the house, Melanie explained, the loan balance will make it far less appealing. I listened carefully, feeling both overwhelmed and reassured. The plan was coming together, but Melanie wasn't finished. Keep records of everything, she urged. Every interaction with Jessica, every suspicious behavior, every email or text you can find related to Brandon. If this ever goes to court, you'll need evidence. Over the next week, I quietly put everything into motion. I transferred my savings, created the trust, and secured my assets step by step. All the while, I acted like nothing had changed. My conversations with Jessica remained light and casual, and I did my best to keep up appearances. But I knew I couldn't stop there. I needed concrete proof. That's when I decided to hire a private investigator. The man I hired, David Walsh, came highly recommended. He had a reputation for being discreet and thorough. I gave him all the details: Jessica's business trip, her connection to Brandon, and my suspicions. David got to work immediately, tailing Jessica and gathering information. He tracked her movements, watched who she met with, and dug into her communications with Brandon. It didn't take long for him to confirm my worst fears. Jessica and Brandon were careful. They weren't openly affectionate in public. But David managed to capture a few key moments: a lingering glance, a private lunch, and an evening spent at a secluded cafe. In the photos and videos David provided, their body language said it all. They leaned in close, their expressions soft and familiar. It didn't look like two colleagues discussing business. It looked like two people sharing something personal, something intimate. Seeing those images made my heart sink. It was no longer just suspicion. The proof was right there in front of me, and now I had to decide what to do next. David Walsh was a man of few words, but meticulous in his work. He wasted no time getting started on the investigation. Jessica and Brandon were careful, never openly affectionate, or spending too much time together in public. But even the most cautious people make mistakes. David caught a few telling moments: a lingering glance over coffee, a private lunch that stretched too long, and an evening meeting at a quiet cafe tucked away from prying eyes. In the photos and videos he gathered, the connection between them was undeniable. Their body language said more than words ever could. They weren't just co-workers discussing spreadsheets. They looked like two people who shared something much more personal. When I saw the images, my heart sank. It wasn't overwhelming proof, but it would hold weight in court. I didn't give David more time to dig further. I had seen enough. It was time to act. With everything in place, I met with Melanie to finalize the divorce papers. We reviewed every clause and ensured my assets were protected exactly as we had planned. Jessica would be left with far less than she might have expected, and I was determined to shield myself from any more damage. Once the papers were ready, I quietly packed my essentials. I didn't want a confrontation. I simply wanted out. Without saying a word, I left. I drove across the country to a small town, far away from the memories of my old life. I checked into a quiet, nondescript hotel, letting the days pass by in silence. I knew it wouldn't take long for Jessica to return to an empty house. When she came back from her business trip a few days later, the house was eerily quiet. At first, she must have thought I was working late or out with friends. But when she walked into the kitchen and saw the envelope on the counter, she knew something was wrong. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were the divorce papers, neatly signed and stamped. There was nothing else, no note, no explanation. Just the cold, hard reality of what had happened. Jessica stood there, frozen in place, staring at the papers in disbelief. It must have felt like her world had come crashing down, with no warning and no way to fix it. She tried everything to find me. She called my phone, but the number was disconnected. She searched for me online, only to discover my social media accounts had vanished. She reached out to mutual friends, hoping someone could tell her where I'd gone. But I had made sure no one could track me. I had disappeared from her life completely, leaving her with nothing but questions and regrets. Meanwhile, I sat alone in my hotel room, the weight of everything pressing down on me. The betrayal, the broken trust, and the doubts I had pushed aside for so long were now undeniable. The stress gnawed at me, keeping me awake at night. I couldn't escape the thoughts running through my mind, and the loneliness became almost unbearable. I knew I had to get away, farther than a hotel room in a small town. I needed real solitude. After some searching, I found a cabin deep in the woods, surrounded by nothing but trees and open sky. It was exactly what I needed: a quiet, isolated place to clear my mind and figure out my next steps. I quit my job. The office, with its endless meetings and constant reminders of Jessica and Brandon, was the last place I wanted to be. The cabin became my sanctuary. I spent my days reflecting, trying to make peace with what had happened. When the divorce trial began, I didn't show up in person. Melanie handled everything, keeping me updated through video calls when necessary. Jessica, on the other hand, walked into court expecting to have the upper hand. I imagine she thought she could spin a sympathetic story, maybe sway the judge with her pregnancy. But she was in for a rude awakening. Melanie had prepared for everything. My assets were locked away in trust funds, hidden in offshore accounts, and the house was devalued thanks to the strategic loan we'd taken out. There was nothing for Jessica to claim. All she had left were the divorce papers and her growing frustration. Jessica's anger must have been palpable, but her options were limited. Desperate, she tried to use her pregnancy to gain sympathy. She likely thought the judge would see her as a vulnerable mother-to-be and rule in her favor. But Melanie was one step ahead. She presented my medical records, showing I had contracted an STD, something Jessica couldn't deny. And then came the photos and videos of her and Brandon, gathered by David. It was all laid out, piece by piece, until there was no room left for excuses. Jessica's advantage crumbled in minutes. She had walked into that courtroom thinking she was in control, but by the time it was over, she left with nothing. The life she had planned, the security she thought she had, was gone. I imagine that moment must have been devastating for her. After the trial, Jessica went to see Brandon. Maybe she was hoping he'd offer some comfort or reassurance. But when she arrived at his place, she found a very different version of the man she once knew. Brandon's expression was cold, his frustration obvious. "You ruined everything," he hissed. Jessica froze, her mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came out. "I thought you'd have enough sense to keep quiet about the pregnancy until we had things figured out," he continued. "But no, you had to rush in and tell him. Now Michael has cut us off completely." Jessica's heart must have sunk. She had believed Brandon cared about her, that they were in this together. But the man standing in front of her now wasn't the charming co-worker she had fallen for. Brandon was furious, not because he'd lost her, but because his plan to take me down had failed. "You were supposed to help me ruin him," he said, shaking his head. "Instead, you blew it." Jessica finally found her voice. "I thought we were doing this because we cared about each other," she said quietly, her voice trembling. Brandon scoffed. "This was never about love, Jess. It was about winning." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "What about the baby?" she asked, tears welling up in her eyes. Brandon's response was cold and heartless. "What baby?" he sneered. "How do I know? It's even mine." Without another word, he turned his back on her, leaving Jessica standing there, alone and broken. In that moment, she realized she had lost everything. Me, the life we built together, and even the man she thought she could rely on. When Jessica showed up at Brandon's place, she wasn't prepared for the look on his face. The anger in his eyes made her stop dead in her tracks. "You ruined everything," he spat, his glare cutting right through her. Jessica flinched, her heart pounding. "What do you mean?" Brandon's expression twisted with frustration. "I thought you'd have enough sense to keep quiet about the pregnancy until we had everything figured out," he hissed. "But no, you just had to rush into it. And now Michael has completely shut us out." A chill ran down Jessica's spine. She had convinced herself that what they had was real, that Brandon cared for her, that they were in this together. But seeing the cold anger on his face, an unsettling doubt crept into her mind. This wasn't the man she thought she knew. There was no warmth in his gaze, no trace of affection or concern. He looked like a man who'd just lost a game he was determined to win. "I thought," Jessica stammered, struggling to find the words. "I thought we were in this together. I thought we were doing this because we cared about each other." Brandon scoffed and rolled his eyes. "Together?" he snapped. "This was never about love, Jess. You were supposed to help me take Michael down. That's all this was." Jessica's heart sank, shame and fear swirling inside her. Brandon cut her off, his voice sharp. "But no, you had to go and tell him about the baby too soon. We could have checked everything first, lined up the paperwork, made sure we secured his assets. But now it's all gone. He's moved everything, and we're left with nothing." Jessica felt her chest tighten. How had she been so blind? She had convinced herself that Brandon cared, that he was different from Michael. But now it was painfully clear. He had used her. She had been nothing more than a pawn in his plan for revenge. Before she could say another word, Brandon waved her off. "You know what?" His tone was cold, final. "I don't want anything to do with you anymore. You ruined the whole thing." Jessica felt tears sting her eyes, but she held them back, refusing to break down in front of him. "But the baby," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She hoped, prayed, for some shred of sympathy from him, any sign that he cared. Brandon let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "What baby?" he said mockingly. He gave her a dismissive wave, his annoyance clear. "Who knows who else you've been with? Don't pin that on me." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Jessica standing there, stunned and shattered. It hit her all at once. She had lost everything. Michael, the life they had built together, and now even the man she thought she could lean on. She was completely alone. Months later, after her son was born, Jessica faced the harsh reality of her situation. The financial strain, the emotional weight, it was overwhelming. She knew she had no choice but to take legal action against Brandon. It wasn't an easy decision. She knew the road ahead would be complicated and full of conflict. But she needed to think about her child's future. Despite Brandon's claims that he had no responsibility and didn't want to be involved, the truth was clear. He was the father, and he had a legal obligation to support his son. Jessica's lawyer filed a lawsuit for child support, citing irrefutable evidence, including a DNA test that confirmed Brandon's paternity. As the court date drew closer, Jessica steeled herself for the battle. She knew Brandon would fight it. He wasn't the type to accept responsibility without a fight. But this time, there was no turning back. She had to stand up for her son. The day of the hearing arrived, and Jessica walked into the courtroom with quiet determination. Her lawyer sat by her side, offering steady support. Across the room, Brandon slumped in his seat, his annoyance written all over his face. He hadn't expected her to take him to court. He probably assumed she would let it slide or try to handle things privately. But Jessica wasn't the same woman he had manipulated before. As the proceedings began, Jessica's lawyer presented the DNA test results. The evidence was undeniable. Brandon was the father. The lawyer argued that, as the child's biological parent, Brandon was legally obligated to contribute to his upbringing. Brandon's lawyer tried to twist the narrative, arguing that Brandon hadn't willingly been involved in the pregnancy, that he had never agreed to have a child, and that Jessica had made the decision to go through with it on her own. Jessica sat quietly, her resolve unshaken. She knew Brandon would try to weasel his way out of this. But as the argument dragged on, Brandon started to lose his cool. His lawyer barely managed to get through his defense before Brandon, clearly agitated, interrupted. "This is ridiculous," Brandon shouted, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "I didn't ask for this. I never agreed to any of it," Brandon shouted, his voice echoing off the courtroom walls. His face was flushed, and his fists were clenched at his sides. "I shouldn't be forced to pay for a kid I didn't want." Jessica's expression hardened, but she remained calm, sitting tall beside her lawyer. Despite the sting of his words, she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. "Mr. Carter, you are the father," the judge said firmly, her voice cutting through the noise like a knife. "And as such, you are legally obligated to provide child support. The DNA test confirms this. This case is closed, and payments will begin immediately." Brandon's face turned an even deeper shade of red, his body trembling with suppressed rage. His jaw tightened as he muttered under his breath, "This isn't over. I'll make you regret this." The judge didn't acknowledge his outburst. She simply finalized the ruling, making it clear that he would be responsible for contributing to his son's welfare from that point forward. Jessica sat quietly as Brandon stormed out of the courtroom, his frustration radiating off him like heat. She watched him go, her heart feeling both heavy and strangely lighter at the same time. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. After months of fear and uncertainty, she could finally start planning for her and her son's future with a little more stability. But it hadn't been easy, and the emotional toll was far from over. Brandon's fury had been palpable. He clearly had no intention of accepting responsibility gracefully. His refusal to own up to his actions still stung, but Jessica knew she had done what she needed to do. As she sat in the courtroom, gathering her thoughts, she realized that this was only the beginning of a new chapter in her life. It wouldn't be easy. She'd have to navigate this path alone. But for the first time in a long while, she felt empowered. 2 years passed, and life for Jessica slowly fell into a routine. She managed to keep things together, thanks largely to the support of her family. Her parents and siblings stepped in when things felt overwhelming, offering help with her son and emotional support when she needed it most. But despite their help, an emptiness lingered. Jessica tried to start fresh. She even considered dating again, but every attempt seemed doomed from the start. Men didn't stick around for long once they learned about her past or her son. And Brandon? He had vanished from her life entirely, apart from the monthly child support payments he begrudgingly sent. Her days were lonely. Her nights were worse. When the house fell silent, memories of her mistakes haunted her. She would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, overwhelmed by regret. Her thoughts often drifted back to Michael, wondering where he was, how he was doing, and how things might have been different if she had made better choices. The guilt gnawed at her, eating away at her peace of mind. The weight of her conscience felt unbearable at times. Meanwhile, Brandon's life had spiraled out of control. Months of reckless behavior had finally caught up with him. After bouncing from one meaningless fling to another, he found himself lying in a hospital bed, barely conscious and in excruciating pain. His body was broken, his mind clouded by a haze of agony and regret. It all started when the husband of one of the women he had infected with HIV tracked him down. The man, devastated and furious, had hunted Brandon for months. He wanted revenge for the pain Brandon had caused his family. One evening, when Brandon returned home, the confrontation happened. The husband wasted no time. Fueled by rage, he attacked Brandon without mercy. The first blow came from a baseball bat, cracking against Brandon's ribs. The man didn't stop there. He kept swinging, hitting Brandon over and over until he was on the brink of unconsciousness. Then, pulling a knife from his pocket, the man did something Brandon never thought possible. He castrated him. Without a word, the husband took the severed pieces and tossed them to a stray dog that wandered by, watching as the animal devoured them right in front of Brandon's horrified eyes. By the time the police arrived, Brandon was barely alive. He was rushed to the hospital, where doctors worked frantically to save him. But the damage was done. Brandon suffered multiple broken bones and severe internal injuries. Worse, he would never walk properly again. And as for any thoughts of intimacy or sex, those days were over forever. Brandon's troubles didn't end there. Word of his reckless actions spread quickly, and 3 women he had infected with HIV filed lawsuits against him. Their husbands joined the lawsuits, demanding compensation for the devastation Brandon had caused in their lives. Marriages crumbled as the truth came to light. The infected women faced rejection from their spouses, who couldn't bear to stay with them after learning about the disease. Divorce proceedings followed, leaving a trail of broken families, anger, and confusion in their wake. Brandon had destroyed lives, not just his own, but the lives of everyone he had crossed paths with. Jessica heard about all of it through the news. At first, she didn't know what to think. She had been waiting on his child support payment, but when it didn't arrive, she reached out to him. That's when she learned the truth. Brandon told her what had happened, his voice weak and bitter over the phone. Jessica sat silently, processing it all. Karma has strange ways of working, she whispered to herself as she hung up the phone. Brandon had caused so much pain and suffering. Now it seemed the universe was delivering justice. Jessica didn't feel happy about what had happened to him. There was no joy in hearing about another person's suffering. But at the same time, she couldn't help but feel that he deserved it. He had ruined lives, manipulated people, and treated others as disposable. Now he was paying the price for those choices. For Jessica, it was a sobering reminder that actions always have consequences. As she reflected on everything that had happened, she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't change the past, but she could focus on her future, and more importantly, her son's future. While Jessica struggled to piece her life back together, Michael had already begun a new chapter of his own, one filled with solitude, discovery, and healing. After the divorce, he realized he couldn't stay in the city any longer. Every street corner seemed to hold a memory. Every familiar face reminded him of what had been lost. The weight of it all had become too much to bear. So, with a packed bag and no clear destination, he left it all behind. At first, he wandered aimlessly. He rented small cabins in different towns, never staying in one place for too long. But it wasn't until he found himself surrounded by towering trees and the vast silence of the wilderness that he finally felt something shift inside him. The noise in his mind began to quiet, replaced by the rhythmic sounds of nature. The rustling leaves, the distant calls of birds, the gentle crash of waves against the shore. Michael started to spend his days hiking up mountain trails, camping under the stars, and watching sunrises from lonely hilltops. Each step he took felt like he was shedding a part of his old life, leaving behind the bitterness, anger, and betrayal that had consumed him for so long. It wasn't just the physical act of exploring that helped him heal. It was the stillness, the simplicity of life away from the chaos. Out there, he didn't need to think about betrayal or failed relationships. All that mattered was the present moment. The warmth of the sun on his face, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots, the cool breeze carrying the scent of pine. To capture these moments, he started taking videos, short clips of sun-dappled forests, misty lakes, and rugged mountaintops. At first, the recordings were just for himself, a way to remember the places that brought him peace. But soon, he began sharing them online, creating a blog to document his journey. He called it Lost and Found. What started as a simple project soon grew into something much bigger. His candid storytelling and breathtaking footage resonated with people across the world. They saw a man who had been broken, slowly putting himself back together through the beauty of the natural world. Michael's followers were captivated by his honesty. He didn't hide the pain he had been through, but he also showed how he was finding peace in the quiet moments, sitting by a campfire, watching the stars, or simply walking through an open field. His videos weren't just about nature. They were about rediscovery, about learning how to live again after heartbreak. The blog took off in ways he never expected. His subscriber count grew steadily, and the comments poured in. Words of encouragement, stories from people who had experienced their own losses, and even messages of gratitude for sharing his journey so openly. Before long, Lost and Found became more than just a personal outlet. It became his livelihood. The income he made from his videos allowed him to keep traveling, keep exploring, and keep finding new places to heal. It wasn't just his online audience that kept him grounded. On one of his camping trips, he came across a stray dog, a scruffy, golden retriever mix with soulful brown eyes and an energy that instantly lifted Michael's spirits. The dog followed him back to his tent that night, and, after sharing a meal of canned beans and jerky, refused to leave his side. Michael named him Max. Max quickly became more than a companion. He became family. The loyal dog followed him on every hike, curled up beside him by the fire each night, and eagerly greeted him each morning. There was something comforting about Max's unwavering loyalty. Unlike people, Max didn't lie, cheat, or betray. He was there, every day, offering unconditional love and trust. For the first time in years, Michael felt a sense of wholeness. One evening, after a long day of hiking through the Rockies, Michael sat by the fire with Max at his feet. As he scrolled through comments on one of his latest videos, he smiled at the familiar names of his loyal followers. They thanked him for his stories, for showing them a path to healing, for reminding them that life could go on after loss. But one comment made him stop cold. It was simple, but the words hit him like a punch to the gut. "I recognize you. I'm sorry for everything that happened. I was wrong. Please forgive me. I apologize for reaching out this way, but I have no other way to contact you. Just know that I deeply regret it." Michael's heart skipped a beat. He knew exactly who had written it. Jessica. She must have stumbled upon his blog, maybe by accident, or maybe she had been searching for him. Either way, her message stirred something deep inside him. For a long time, he just sat there, staring at the screen. Memories of their life together came flooding back. The good moments, the laughter, the way she used to make him feel like he belonged. But then came the darker memories. The lies. The betrayal. The crushing realization that everything he thought they had built together had been a facade. Despite everything, though, he realized he didn't feel anger anymore. The pain was still there, lingering like a dull ache. But it wasn't the sharp, burning rage he had once carried. Time, distance, and the peace he had found in nature had softened those wounds. After a long pause, Michael began typing a response. "I do not hold a grudge. God will judge us. Live happily." He stared at the words for a moment before clicking send. As he closed his laptop, a wave of closure washed over him. It was done. The chapter of his life that had haunted him for so long was finally over. He had made peace with the past. He no longer carried the weight of betrayal or regret. Now, he was free to move forward, with Max by his side, a growing community of supporters, and the open road ahead of him. The future wasn't certain, but it was filled with possibility. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Michael looked forward with hope in his heart and peace in his soul. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. See you soon.